When Mark and Ellen Whitman moved into their newly purchased waterfront mansion in Westport, Connecticut, they felt like they had finally made it. The sprawling estate, once owned by the legendary talk show host Phil Donahue, had been on the market for months after his passing in 2024. Though some locals whispered about the house carrying an eerie presence, the couple dismissed it as small-town superstition. Ellen, an interior designer, marveled at the open-concept living spaces, the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Long Island Sound, and the antique library filled with books from Donahue's personal collection. Mark, a corporate lawyer, was drawn to the home's history, its grand architecture, the celebrity status attached to it, and the promise of a peaceful escape from New York City's relentless pace. Their first few nights in the house were blissful. They sipped wine on the back patio, listened to the waves crashing against the rocks, and reveled in their good fortune. But then, small disturbances began to surface, things that could be explained but still sent a chill up Ellen's spine. A framed photograph on the mantel tilted ever so slightly, though no one had touched it. A whisper, low and indistinct, hummed through the hallway in the dead of night. Ellen woke up to the sound of the front door unlocking itself, though Mark insisted it was just the old house settling. But by the end of the first week, there was no denying that something was wrong. One evening, Ellen was alone in the house, arranging furniture in the study. The old leather chair by the fireplace had been Donahue's favorite, according to the realtor. She ran her hand over the worn armrest and felt an overwhelming sadness, a deep, aching grief that didn't belong to her. Then, from the corner of her eye, she saw it. The chair, empty just moments before, now had an indent, as if someone had just sat down. Ellen's breath hitched. She turned, expecting Mark to have returned home early, but the house was silent. Then, without warning, the chair's back creaked, shifting slightly as though its unseen occupant had just leaned forward. Ellen bolted from the room, slamming the door behind her. When she told Mark that night, he laughed it off. "You're letting your imagination get the best of you," he said. But when he woke up at 3:12 a.m. to the sound of someone pacing outside their bedroom door, the color drained from his face. He got up, yanked open the door, and found the hallway empty. But just as he was about to close it, a voice, soft, almost conversational, whispered from the darkness. "Is anyone listening?" They called a home inspector the next morning, convinced there had to be some rational explanation. Maybe air vents shifting, maybe faulty wiring. But the inspector found nothing, no drafts, no loose pipes, nothing to explain the voices or the phantom movements. A week later, Ellen was in the master bathroom when she saw it again. The large vanity mirror had fogged up after her shower, and as she reached for a towel, she noticed something, a single, handwritten word drawn into the condensation. "Listen." Ellen stumbled back, heart pounding. She wiped the glass with a shaking hand, but as soon as the fog cleared, a dark shape moved behind her reflection. She spun around, expecting to see Mark. But no one was there. That night, Mark finally admitted he'd seen something, too. A shadowy figure in the hallway, standing just outside their bedroom door. At first, he thought it was a trick of the light, but then it moved slowly, deliberately, watching. They both agreed, whatever was in the house, it wasn't just their imagination. Desperate for answers, Ellen began researching the history of the house, digging into old interviews, archived newspaper articles, and real estate records. She learned that Phil Donahue had been deeply attached to this home, spending his final years here in seclusion, often speaking about the importance of deep conversation, of truly being heard. One detail struck her the hardest. In the weeks before his passing, Donahue had recorded an unpublished memoir dictating his final thoughts into a tape recorder late at night. But those recordings were never found. What if that's why he was still here? The next evening, Ellen and Mark sat in the study, the room where Donahue had spent so much of his time. They placed a recorder on the desk, turned off the lights, and spoke softly into the darkness. "Phil," Ellen said, her voice barely above a whisper, "what do you want us to hear?" For a moment, nothing. Then, in the silence, the chair by the fireplace creaked again. The recorder, untouched, clicked on, and a voice, deep, worn, unmistakably Phil Donahue's, whispered back, "Listen." After that night, the disturbances lessened. The whispers faded. The shadow stopped appearing in the hallway. It was as if, finally, Donahue had gotten what he had always wanted: someone to listen, truly listen, to what he had left behind. Ellen and Mark never found the lost recordings, but in a way they didn't need to. They knew now that the house wasn't haunted by something malevolent, but by a presence longing to be understood. They stayed. And every so often, late at night, when the wind carried the sound of the waves through the open windows, they swore they could still hear it. The faint echo of a voice, just beyond the veil of reality, still asking, "Is anyone listening?" Don't forget to subscribe and like if you liked this story. The nights grew quieter, but the silence was uneasy, stretched taut like an old rope on the verge of fraying. Mark and Ellen Whitman had begun to settle into a fragile normalcy, yet the house still breathed in a way they couldn't explain. It was in the little things: the way the air in the study remained heavy, unmoved by the open windows, the way the old floorboards groaned in slow, deliberate protest when no one was walking across them, the way Ellen sometimes woke up at night with the feeling that she wasn't alone, her skin prickling as though unseen eyes traced the curves of her silhouette beneath the sheets. Mark pretended not to notice, or maybe he convinced himself that if he ignored it long enough, the house would lose interest in them. He buried himself in work, taking long calls in his office, pretending that every soft creak and distant sigh was just another sound an old house made. Ellen, however, couldn't let it go. The study, that room with its worn leather chair and towering bookshelves, still held something just beyond her grasp. She had taken to spending her evenings there, running her fingers along the spines of the books Donahue had left behind, reading their titles aloud as if they might form some kind of message. Some were heavy volumes on philosophy, others memoirs from past guests he'd interviewed, their pages yellowed, edges curling from time. And then there was the journal. It was tucked between two larger books on the middle shelf, its binding cracked, its leather cover worn smooth by time and use. When Ellen pulled it free, dust rose in a delicate cloud, catching the dim lamplight in its slow descent. The initials PD were embossed in faded gold on the cover, so faint she might have missed them if she hadn't been looking so closely. She hesitated, fingers tightening around the worn edges. It felt wrong, somehow like prying into a stranger's mind, like reading a love letter never meant to be sent. But then the floor creaked behind her. She turned, pulse leaping. Nothing, just the empty room, the old leather chair motionless in the corner, its high back catching the shadows. Ellen swallowed hard and opened the journal. The pages were filled with tight, slanted handwriting. The ink faded in places but still legible. It wasn't a diary, not exactly. There were no dated entries, no confessions of the mundane. Instead, it was a collection of thoughts, ideas, fragments of conversations that had never made it to air. Notes on the nature of truth, on the responsibility of asking the right questions, on the fear of being forgotten. She read for hours, hunched over in the dim glow of the lamp, the silence pressing in around her. The words on the page felt urgent, unfinished, as though Donahue had been reaching for something, trying to pin down a thought before it slipped through his fingers. And then, near the back of the journal, a passage stood out. "There is something in this house. I feel it at night. I hear it in the walls. If I disappear before I finish, let them know I was not alone." Ellen's breath hitched. The words sent a shiver crawling up her spine, cold and thin like a draft sneaking through an open window. She read the passage again, slower this time, feeling the weight of it settle into her bones. The house groaned. A sound, low and distant, like a breath moving through the walls. She looked up, pulse hammering against her ribs. The air in the study had changed, thickening, taking on a quality she couldn't name. She had spent weeks in this house, had told herself over and over that whatever was here wasn't trying to hurt them. But as the silence deepened, as the dim light of the lamp flickered once, twice, she wasn't so sure anymore. A sound, soft, almost imperceptible, a whisper, not from the hallway, not from beyond the door, from behind her, from the chair. The old leather groaned as though under shifting weight. She turned slowly, and in the faint glow of the lamplight, she saw what she had dreaded. The chair was no longer empty. The air in the study thickened, pressing in on Ellen like the weight of unseen hands. The chair, once a silent, inanimate thing, now held an unmistakable presence. It was not simply the way the leather sagged, as if someone had just settled into it, nor the way the dim light of the lamp cast an elongated shadow against the bookshelves, one that did not quite match the shape of the chair itself. It was the feeling, a deep, sinking awareness in the pit of her stomach, an undeniable certainty that she was no longer alone. She wanted to look away, to turn and run, but she was frozen in place, her breath caught somewhere between her ribs. The seconds stretched long, stretching out like fragile threads pulled too tight. Then, ever so slowly, the chair creaked. It was not a sharp, sudden sound but a deliberate one, the slow compression of aged leather, the faint whisper of fabric shifting against itself. A movement. Ellen's pulse thundered in her ears. She told herself it was impossible, that there was no one there, that it was only an old chair settling. But some primal part of her, something older than logic, something raw and instinctual, told her otherwise. She could feel it watching, not with eyes, not in a way she could define, but with a presence that seemed to press against her skin, creeping up the nape of her neck like a cold breath. She should leave, get out, go upstairs, wake Mark. But her body did not listen. Instead, her fingers clenched around the edges of the journal, holding onto it as though it were an anchor, as though it could tether her to something solid, something real. Then the whisper came again, low, frayed at the edges, as though pulled from the depths of static and time itself. Is anyone listening? A chill spread through her, slow and deep, sinking into the marrow of her bones. Her grip tightened on the journal, her knuckles pale against the worn leather cover. It had to be in her head. Had to be. She forced herself to move, muscles trembling with the effort. One step back, then another. The floorboards groaned beneath her weight, but the sound seemed impossibly distant, drowned beneath the thudding of her own pulse. And then, a shift. Not from the chair this time, from the bookshelf. A single book slid forward, dislodging itself from the tightly packed row of old hardcovers. The motion was slow, deliberate, as though unseen fingers had reached out and pulled it free. It teetered for a moment on the edge of the shelf, caught in a moment of stillness. Then it fell. The heavy thud against the floor was deafening in the hush of the room. Ellen flinched. The silence that followed was suffocating. She stared at the fallen book, its worn spine facing upward. The title, barely visible in the dim light, sent another jolt through her. Conversations with the Dead. The air in the room turned heavy, thick with something unseen. She couldn't breathe, couldn't think. Then, a shadow moved. Not a trick of the light, not her imagination. A real, shifting shape, just beyond the lamplight's reach, where the glow met the darkness. And this time, when the whisper came, it was closer. Too close. Are you listening now? The room felt smaller now. The walls, once grand and lined with history, seemed to close in as if they were no longer just wood and plaster but something alive, something aware. Ellen's breath came shallow and uneven, her ribs tight with the weight of an invisible presence. The book lay on the floor between her and the chair, its pages slightly fanned out as if gasping for air. Conversations with the Dead. The title stared back at her, the gold lettering catching the dim light like an unblinking eye. She swallowed hard, forcing herself to move, to shift even the slightest inch. But her legs felt leaden, bound by some unseen force that made her an unwilling spectator to something she did not understand. The air stirred, not from an open window, not from any natural movement of the house, but from the chair. A faint exhale, something too soft to be wind yet too real to be imagined. The pages of the fallen book fluttered. Ellen's hands clenched into fists, her nails pressing into the flesh of her palms, grounding herself in sensation. The leather of the chair stretched again. Another creak, slow and measured, like weight shifting ever so slightly. And then, a whisper. Not the disembodied, drifting murmur she had heard before. No, this time it was direct. right behind her. Pick it up. Ellen's body went rigid. The words slithered through the air, too close, too intimate, breath brushing the back of her neck, though there was nothing there. She squeezed her eyes shut, heartbeat hammering against her ribs, her pulse a frantic drumbeat in the thick silence. No, she was not going to do this. She forced herself to move, to break the stillness, to act. With a sharp inhale, she bent down, fingers trembling as they brushed the cover of the book. The leather was cool beneath her touch, worn smooth from years of handling. She could feel the weight of it, heavy with something more than paper and ink. She turned it over, and there scrawled in faded ink on the inside cover was a name. Phil Donahue. Not a printed dedication, not a title page. It was handwritten, personal, and beneath it, smaller, barely legible through the faded ink. They never let me finish. A shudder ran through Ellen, a deep, marrow-deep unease that settled in her bones like damp cold. The book was his, a book about speaking to the dead. Her lips parted, a breathless question forming, but before she could utter a sound, the lamp flickered, once, twice, then it died. Darkness swallowed the room. Ellen gasped, staggering back, her grip tightening around the book like it was the only thing keeping her grounded. Her ears strained, searching for movement, for sound, for anything. And then, the chair. It scraped against the floor, slowly, deliberately, as though its unseen occupant had just stood up. And in the pitch-black void of the study, a single, low breath unfurled. Right next to her ear. The breath was real. She could feel it, not cold, not hot, but something worse. The absence of both, a whisper of air that should not have been there at all. It coiled against her skin like the slow exhale of something waiting. Ellen did not move. She could not move. Her fingers clenched around the book, its worn leather cover pressing into her palm, grounding her in the dark. Every muscle in her body screamed for her to run, to throw open the door, to flee into the safety of the hallway, to call for Mark. But she knew, with a certainty deeper than fear, that whatever was in the room with her wanted her to move, wanted her to acknowledge it, to react. The air thickened, pressing down on her, a silent pressure against her chest. Then, from the depths of the darkness, the whisper came again. They never let me finish. Ellen shuddered. Her eyes adjusted, just enough to make out the vaguest of shapes, the outlines of the furniture, the faintest gleam of what might have been the brass buttons on the chair's upholstery. And then, beyond it, something darker than the dark itself. A shape, standing, watching. The space where its face should have been was empty, but she knew it was staring at her. The book in her hands felt heavier now, almost electric, as if something unseen was shifting inside its pages. And then, before she could stop herself, her hands moved, guided by some force she couldn't name, flipping the book open. The pages turned too quickly at first, rustling like a whispering wind, then stopped abruptly, unnaturally, as though they had been chosen. She forced herself to look. The ink was old, faded, but the words were still legible. A passage, underlined in a hand that was both rushed and determined. We are not heard. We are not seen. We are left to wander between the spaces where voices fade and silence takes hold. But we are still here, still waiting. A shadow moved, not from the chair, from right beside her. Ellen sucked in a sharp breath, her body tensing so violently that she nearly dropped the book. The darkness around her felt thicker now, closer, and then something touched her shoulder. Not a brush, not a gust of air. A hand, fingertips, faint and cold, pressing against the fabric of her sweater. She spun, instinct overtaking her terror, but there was nothing. Just the suffocating dark, the silent weight of the room. But the touch lingered, and then, a voice. Not the distant, whispering murmur she had heard before. This was right behind her. Low, raspy. Finish it. Ellen staggered back, her breath coming in sharp, uneven bursts. The book trembled in her hands. And then the pages began to turn on their own. One by one, slow and deliberate, as if unseen fingers were flipping through them, searching, waiting, commanding. She could not breathe. Her pulse pounded against her ribs, her hands frozen in place, her body caught between fight and flight. The pages stopped, and there beneath the faded ink of Donahue's own handwriting was something new, something that had not been there before. Fresh ink. The words, scrawled in hurried, desperate strokes. "Are you listening now?" A deep, shuddering breath filled the room. The chair creaked again, shifting forward, as if its unseen occupant was rising. The darkness around her moved. Ellen slammed the book shut. The whispering stopped. The silence that followed was heavy, suffocating, as if the house itself was holding its breath. Then slowly, so slowly she reached out, her fingers trembling, and placed the book back onto the desk. She did not look at the chair. She did not look at the shadows. She turned and walked out of the room. She did not run, did not scream, because she knew deep in her marrow, deeper than fear itself, that if she ran, if she broke the stillness, it would follow. She closed the door behind her. The handle was cold beneath her palm. The hallway was empty, silent, stretching long and dark toward the stairs where the soft glow of a bedside lamp still burned in the master bedroom. Mark was asleep, oblivious. The house, to him, was just a house. But Ellen knew the truth now, knew what the whispers had meant, knew why Phil Donahue had lingered here, why his presence had not faded even after his death. It was not because he had been forgotten. It was because he had never finished, because no one had listened, and now someone had.